Obviously, we know what's going on, right? We know. Come on, let's be honest with ourselves. We live in a world where the world is not what it seems. It's not. It's not the way you were taught at school. It's not the way you. It's not. It's just. Everything just seems like it's not how it's supposed to be. And you always had this feeling in the back of your mind like something wasn't right. As a child, very early on, I always have these ideas. I always questioned everything. Even my poor mother, she's a Catholic lady. And so I would always ask her, why are we going to church? Why do we have to do this? Why do we have to pray? Why do we have to go here, go there? Why do we need to say thank you, Lord? I would always question everything. And it all started with me just like, why do I have to go to school? Why do I need to go to school? You know, I had a sort of like a self awareness awakening. And this is just my personal experience where I just I would be just a little too aware of my surroundings, of where I am, what I'm doing, and I would always just stare at my hand. I would look at all the crevices, all the lines. When you close your hand, you see the lines. Where a fortune teller apparently tells you if the line crosses here, goes over here, and then comes around here, apparently you're gonna be rich, or you're gonna marry this person, or you're gonna die at this day. Who knows? Some bullshit like that. But I would always just stare at my hand, and I would just wonder, like, it's not like I would wonder anything crazy, but I would just look at my hand and just stare at it, see how it moves. How every time I'm wiggling my fingers, the limbs inside my hand, you can see that there's things inside there that are controlling, and obviously, and then I go through this little rabbit hole in my mind. How I'm like, how am I, just the idea of that I'm controlling these fingers, that I'm controlling this hand, and it's just instantaneous, and it's just closing it, opening it, closing it, opening it. And then sometimes, you just stare in the mirror. Sometimes I just stare at myself in the mirror. I look into my eyes and I stare into the pupil. I look into the iris of my eyes and notice that there's like little crevices. And this is me at a young age, like elementary school, 8, 9, 10 years old. And I just notice things, notice the texture of things. And then I would just go outside and I look up into the sky and see all the stars that were surrounding my entire view. And I would just see so many stars. I'm 32 years old, by the way. Born 1983. I grew up living in the middle of nowhere, in the desert, basically. A place called Sky Valley, near the Coachella Valley. And growing up there, you could see more of the night sky, more of the stars. And at 5 years old, I would say, I would just look up into the sky and just look at the stars. And at 5 years old, I still hadn't been really introduced to like sci-fi movies or anything like that, but I did know of Star Wars. My dad had um, he was the one that got me introduced into sci-fi movies and all that, and he's also the one that introduced me to the idea of aliens because of tabloids that he would often get when we were checking out through the grocery store. He would pick up some of those old school tabloids, the ones that were black and white. But I guess what I'm getting at is that I've been so aware of my surroundings, my existence, and regardless of where I lived, we never stayed there for a long time in Sky Valley. We ended up moving closer to the city and stuff, and so still, even with the light pollution, I would still have enough visible light from the stars that I would be able to just look at them and just be in awe. And then course of growing up, I would get introduced to all these movies. Star Wars was obviously the first thing that I got introduced to, but Independence Day, 2001: Space Odyssey, The Abyss, E.T. the Extraterrestrial, and then one of my favorite movies, Contact, and it just opened up this whole world of like, wow, that is so cool. An entire race of aliens visiting us, or, in a galaxy far, far away, there's civilizations battling it out for dominance or for survival, fighting against the Empire. But part of me was like, I had this idea, this fantasy, and then obviously, you grow up a little bit more and you realize, and then your parents tell you, it's like, oh, it's actually, made up. It's like, they don't actually, these movies aren't real. I don't know. There was a time where I never thought about movies being fictional. I never thought about them that they were being made by, you know, with stunt people hanging on with wires and green screens, and obviously I had no idea how even movies were even made or what the idea, but all I knew that is that when it came onto a TV or saw it on a screen somewhere, it's just like, it's real, it's right there, I see it. I don't know what other way to even take in what I'm seeing, but as a 5-year old, back in that time, I was just, yep, somehow this is real. But obviously, you grow up out of it and realize it's all fake. But yet, you're left wondering, could it ever be possible? And, a lot of that time, I grew up thinking, would it ever be possible to have aliens? Could superheroes exist? Is the government really hiding secrets of the existence of aliens? And then, obviously, there'd be some, I didn't grow up with cable or satellite. I grew up with like an antenna with like, you only get like maybe 5 channels. Well, every now and then, I would get this segment on Fox or talking about where the news would report some crazy UFO story or something like that. I'd be like, what? But then you watch that news segment or something, some sort of segment of some crazy person apparently getting abducted or seeing a UFO, and they would just laugh it off like, oh, it's probably some crazy person, delusional. That's impossible. It's not real. They're just crazy. They just saw something like a plane or something. But then, but I always in the back of my mind wondered, would it be possible? And then, you get introduced to like all different types of genre, superhero movies. I grew up watching Smallville, it's the idea of aliens, coming from above, visiting Earth. So fascinating. It was so fascinating to me. And then we finally got a computer in our house. Finally had access to the internet. And this was, Jesus Christ, I didn't get a computer, a family computer, until I was in high school. And when we got internet, man, I just started going down rabbit holes. I started searching, Googling. I came across so many things. I'm probably glossing over some other stuff that I kind of, what led me to these interests that I have about the paranormal, aliens. But man, for the longest time, I would always question my reality. And I was, I would always just have moments of just self awareness of like, where the fuck am I? Like, I feel like I don't belong here. Like, I feel like this world that we live in, it shouldn't be this way. Like, something's wrong, something's off. But looking back on it, it's, as a 32-year-old man, at the time, when you're like a child or a teenager, it kind of seems like, you think you're, I don't know, like it's like whatever. But looking back on it, it's like, Jesus Christ, I was a little kid thinking about these things, having these ideas, and yeah, I was just kind of like just questioning everything. And then obviously I went through rabbit holes and looking up conspiracy theories, hearing people's testimonies, reading articles, watching videos, David Wilcock, Project Camelot, all the, back in the early days of YouTube, back in 2007, no, actually 2008 and 9, when I started looking on YouTube. First, yeah, no, YouTube, yeah, that's where it all started, looking up at, a supposed alien autopsy, that classic alien autopsy video that most of us back in that day would watch, who knew about that video, wondered, could it be real? Was it real? And this is before AI, this is before any deep fake, anything like that. So I just went down rabbit holes, watching hours and hours of videos, staying up late at night, just researching, especially with Project Camelot. God, I forget the name of the guy and the lady who, were partners, who kind of went around interviewing witnesses, Bob Dean, Clifford Stone. So I would just be researching stuff, and yeah, just literally just getting a lot of information fed to me. I didn't even know if it was bullshit or if it was true. All I knew is that I was just getting a lot more information than I could have ever gotten if I didn't have the computer and access to the internet and all that stuff. So it just opened my mind to many more possibilities. And, you know, you just get fed a bunch of information, but that you just don't even know who's telling the truth and who's not, you know? But you started kind of like seeing like some things that just kind of made more sense to you than others, But the idea of knowing the big picture, what's the whole situation? What is it all about? You know, it's something that really captivated me. You know, who are we? What are we doing here? What's the point of it all? You know, you sometimes through religion, you get taught that, God created the universe, the heavens, the earth. You know, supposedly what Earth is only 6,000 years old, but obviously that can't be right. You look up into the universe, the infinite amount of stars and galaxies that are out there. The possibilities of life being out there is astronomical. It's super high. Um, Come on, what are we doing here? Of course, we're not alone, and we've never been alone. But the real question is, you know, how how am I? How much have we been visited? To what extent is the contact? Like, are there really underwater bases? Are there bases underneath the water where we obviously can't go for very much long? Obviously, we've made expeditions, like, for example, James Cameron, who's gone down into the Mariana Trench, but we can't really explore, with to such an extent. We can't actually be there for a very long period of time to even survey the entire, ocean floor, especially at those depths. And we know more about our own universe, you know, than we do about the deepest parts of the ocean. And even if we do know a lot of the information about the ocean, let's say hypothetically we actually do know what's out, and we know so much about the ocean. A lot of that is done through corporations, the Navy, so any information or evidence that's found of whatever extraordinary or whatever it is would be filtered through these said systems and companies, corporations, anything that could potentially fall into certain these, sensitive categories would be classified immediately. And we wouldn't know anything. We wouldn't be able to really ever know what's under there. We would just be fed some story about, like, who knows what's under there? We don't know shit. We can't, but maybe they do, but obviously they would keep that secret. And there's stories about people in submarines, who detect, these fast walkers, or what is a fast walkers? Well, they detect these objects in the ocean, deep in the ocean, moving at such a high speed that it's impossible for any man-made object to move at those speeds. And also to not even be able to affect the surrounding, area around it. It just moves freely. Like, if there's no water there, like, there's no friction, there's nothing, it's seamless. It's amazing. Amazing, the stories. And stories about, like, objects that just kind of just fade away into the deepest parts of the ocean. Just fade into the nothingness, into the most isolated, most deepest parts of the ocean. It's just gone. So it just begs to question it. Makes you wonder: is there an actual base underneath? You know, deep inside the ocean, and probably more than likely yes. And they can move in and out however they want, whenever they want, with ease. Study us, monitor us, whatever. We wouldn't know any different. But kind of went off topic, but the whole point is that of this whole little short, tiny little baby audio podcast is that I've just been questioning reality my whole life. I'm someone who's always keeps to themselves. I don't ever bother anybody. I don't like to cause any drama or, sometimes I can't relate to a lot of people. Sometimes, I'm very introverted for sure. I always like to be by myself, and a lot of times that's all I ever think about. The universe, the meaning of it all. Why are we here? And, don't even get me started on the whole Younger Dryas impact theory. Ancient civilizations, Atlantis, Jesus Christ. What I've learned is that there's more to this world than we ever thought there could be. And we're definitely being lied to. We're definitely, our past is definitely being kept from us. I know it. I don't know it for a fact, but I just know in my heart that there's definitely more to this world, to us. And yeah, hoping some of you guys listen to this. Maybe you guys can relate about the whole self-awareness, being so curious about the stars at such a young age, just being self-aware, just kind of feeling like you're alone. Not alone, but like obviously I have family and I have a big family and cousins and all that stuff, but alone in the sense where like you feel like you're the only one thinking these thoughts. And you can't really relate to a lot of people because they're so focused on what's in front of them and, their own little bubble of reality that they've created, living their life. And there's nothing wrong with any of what I just said of, what people do and how they're so concentrated, paying the bills, going to work, all that stuff. That's important. That's the system. That's the life that we live. And we have to be able to survive. But sometimes I feel like maybe people don't take time to really realize where the hell they really are, what world they're really living in, the lies that they're being fed. But I do think there's more of a growing number of people that are waking up and that know really that this isn't the world that we think it is. And I feel like finally people are kind of slowly catching up to how I've been feeling for a long time. Or maybe I'm just coming to the realization that everyone's been like me the whole time, and because of the internet, because of social media, we are all finding each other. We are all realizing that we're all trying to look for the same thing, the truth. The actual truth. Not some perspective truth, but real truth, actual truth, bad or good, but the truth. And that's what we need. And that's what I feel like we've been wanting for so long. And we need that more than ever right now. And sometimes I feel like the only way we'll ever get that is if us, the people, take the actual step and take the courage to actually, you know, just fucking go for it and take the fucking truth, from the people who are holding it, because they're obviously never going to tell us. They'll manipulate the truth. And then they'll turn it against us. They'll manipulate us and use it, for their own advantage. And it's up to us, the people, to take the truth. Take it away from them. Who knows? I don't want to say by force, but fuck, I don't know. Something's got to give. Something's got to change. I mean, whoever's listening to this, you probably feel the same way. And if this resonated with you, please subscribe. I want to try to do more of these, just audio sort of podcasts, and just kind of just give myself out there, and just maybe I can find other people who think like me or something. I don't know. Build a little community. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. Have a good one.